My son gave me a maid outfit for Mother's Day with a note saying, "Back to your roots." Ruby Nakamura, 70, didn't argue. She put it on. By Thanksgiving, the five-star restaurant I'd been secretly funding for 5 years would be closing its doors forever. And the food critic who destroyed my life 4 decades ago would be writing the review that would resurrect my legacy. When the health department arrived for their surprise inspection, I'd be standing in that kitchen wearing the chef's coat I'd earned 40 years ago, not the uniform my son thought defined me. But before we dive into this incredible journey of dignity, revenge, and the power of knowing your worth, tell me, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city and country in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to witness will change how you think about respect, family, and never underestimating a woman who's been underestimated her entire life. Let me paint you a picture of Ruby Nakamura. Not the woman you'll meet at the end of this story, but the woman she was before life taught her that sometimes the people who should protect your dreams are the ones holding the matches. 40 years ago, Riverton Heights was a different world. The tech boom hadn't gentrified our neighborhood yet. Small businesses could still make it on heart and hard work instead of venture capital and viral marketing. And in the corner of Maple Street and Fifth Avenue stood my pride and joy, Sakura Garden. Sakura Garden wasn't just a restaurant, it was a love letter to two cultures living in harmony. My late husband, Kenji, and I had poured every dollar of our savings, every dream we'd carried across an ocean, every late night and early morning into those 1,200 square feet of polished wood floors and hand-painted cherry blossom murals. I didn't just serve food, I created experiences. My signature dish was something that would make food purists cringe today. A Japanese-Italian ramen that combined my grandmother Yuki's secret miso base with techniques I'd learned working in Mario Benedetti's kitchen downtown. The waiting list for Friday night dinner was 6 weeks long. Food and Wine magazine called it a revolutionary bridge between East and West that honors both traditions while creating something entirely new. Kenji handled the front of house with the kind of warmth that made strangers feel like family. I commanded the kitchen with precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker jealous. We were partners in every sense, in business, in marriage, in the dream that America could be home to anyone willing to work for it. By 1986, we owned the building outright. We employed 17 people, most of them from our neighborhood, most of them immigrants like us, who just needed someone to believe they were worth more than minimum wage and silence. We were planning to expand, maybe open a second location in downtown Riverton. We had a daughter, Yuki, named after my grandmother who would toddle around the restaurant after school, charming customers and learning that food was love made visible. Life was good. Not easy. We worked 7 days a week, 16 hours a day, but good. We were building something that would last, something we could pass down, something that proved we belonged here as much as anyone. March 15th, 1987. I remember the date because it's carved into my memory the way a gravestone marks an ending. That's the day Harrison Blackwell walked into Sakura Garden. He was the food critic for Riverton Metropolitan magazine. In 1987, before the internet, before Yelp, before social media, his word was gospel. One review from Harrison Blackwell could make a restaurant or destroy it completely. He came on a Wednesday night during our busiest dinner service, ordered our tasting menu, 7 courses representing what Kenji and I considered our greatest achievements. I cooked every dish myself, plated each one like I was painting a canvas. The waitstaff told me he seemed to enjoy everything, even asked for seconds on the fusion ramen. 2 weeks later, the review published. The headline was, "East meets West, when cultures collide instead of combine." I still have that clipping, yellowed and brittle now, but every word burned into my memory. Ruby Nakamura's ambitious attempt at fusion cuisine at Sakura Garden reveals the fundamental problem with immigrants trying to appropriate American culinary traditions. While her technical skills are adequate, the result is confused, inauthentic, and ultimately unsatisfying. The Japanese-Italian ramen in particular represents a bastardization of both cultures that serves neither. Perhaps Mrs. Nakamura should focus on mastering the traditions of her homeland before attempting to innovate beyond her capabilities. There's nobility in knowing one's place in the culinary hierarchy. Some of our finest restaurants are run by immigrants who understand that authentic ethnic cuisine, prepared simply and traditionally, is their greatest contribution to our city's dining scene. Innovation requires a level of cultural fluency that cannot be acquired, only inherited. But the closing paragraph was the one that broke me. Ultimately, Sakura Garden feels like a restaurant trying too hard to be something it's not. Mrs. Nakamura would be better served returning to the traditional preparations her grandmother likely taught her rather than playing dress-up in culinary traditions that belong to others. There's dignity and authenticity, something this establishment sorely lacks.
Within a month, our reservation book was empty. Regular customers stopped coming, embarrassed to be associated with what Blackwell had labeled inauthentic. The lunch crowd that once lined up outside our door found other places to spend their money. By June, we couldn't make payroll. By August, the bank was threatening foreclosure. By December, Sakura Garden was closed. The equipment sold to pay debts, the dream that had taken 5 years to build, destroyed by 400 words in a magazine. Kenji took it the hardest. He'd put everything into that restaurant. Not just money, but his identity, his sense of place in this country. He started drinking, stopped sleeping, blamed himself for not being American enough to understand what went wrong. The stress gave him his first heart attack in February 1988. He survived that one. The second one, in November of that year, took him from me. 43 years old, dead from a broken heart that a medical examiner labeled cardiac arrest. I was 38 years old, a widow with a 9-year-old daughter and debt that would take me the next decade to pay off. So I did what immigrants do when the American dream reveals its fine print. I worked. 3 jobs, sometimes 4. Mornings, I cleaned office buildings downtown, the same buildings where executives made decisions over lunch meetings at restaurants that served the kind of food I used to create. Afternoons, I worked prep in restaurant kitchens, chopping vegetables and washing dishes for chefs who treated me like I was invisible. Evenings, I served tables at a chain restaurant near the highway, smiling at customers who never looked me in the eye, accepting tips that sometimes came with comments about how grateful I should be for the work. The irony wasn't lost on me. I went from being called an innovative chef to just another immigrant woman in a service uniform, exactly where Harrison Blackwell thought I belonged. Through all of this, I was raising Daniel, my son, born in 1995, when I was 45 years old and finally stable enough to think about expanding our little family of 2. Daniel never knew his father Kenji, never saw Sakura Garden in its glory days. To him, I was just mom, the woman who worked long hours and came home tired, who made amazing meals from whatever was in the refrigerator, who spoke to him in 3 languages and taught him that respect was earned through character, not inherited through birthright. I told him stories about the restaurant, about his stepfather Kenji, about the life we'd built and lost. But to Daniel, those were just stories, fairy tales about a time before his reality. His reality was his hard-working mother who cleaned buildings and served other people's food, who saved every penny for his college fund, who never complained about the sacrifices she made to give him opportunities she'd never had. Daniel was brilliant. Honor roll every semester, accepted to Riverside University on a partial scholarship. He studied business and hospitality management because he said he wanted to understand the industry that had broken his mother's heart. "Someday, Mom," he'd tell me, "I'm going to open a restaurant and show you how it's supposed to be done." I was so proud of him. Here was my son, American-born, American-educated, ready to take on the world with confidence I'd never been allowed to have. He was going to succeed where I had failed. He was going to prove that our family deserved a seat at the table. 5 years ago, Daniel came to me with his business plan. He'd found the perfect location in Millbrook Heights, the trendy part of town where young professionals lived in converted lofts and spent $15 on cocktails. He wanted to open Jade Garden, a modern Asian fusion restaurant that would appeal to contemporary tastes. The concept was everything I'd dreamed of 40 years ago. Innovative, bridging cultures, creating something new while honoring tradition. But the banks wouldn't give him a loan. Too risky, they said. Unproven concept, they said. The same words I'd heard when Kenji and I had tried to expand Sakura Garden. Daniel was devastated. He had worked so hard, planned so carefully. He was 28 years old and watching his dreams die the same death mine had, just for different reasons. So I made a decision. I emptied my retirement savings. $180,000. Every penny I'd saved from 30 years of work, every dollar I'd put aside for my old age, every cent I planned to leave Daniel as inheritance. I gave it all to him as a silent investment. I told him it was from a private investor who wanted to remain anonymous. I made him promise never to try to find out who it was, said it would violate the agreement. I couldn't bear for him to know that his mother, the woman who cleaned other people's messes, was funding his dream. I wanted him to feel proud, successful, independent. Jade Garden opened 2 years ago to rave reviews. The same food critics who had ignored me 40 years ago praised Daniel's innovative vision and bold fusion concept. Reservations were booked months in advance. Food bloggers called it the future of Asian cuisine in America. I would drive by sometimes just to see the line of people waiting to get in. I'd watch through the windows as Daniel worked the dining room, charming customers the way Kenji used to, while his wife Amanda managed the kitchen with efficiency I recognized in myself. The success was everything I'd dreamed of for him. Everything I'd wanted for myself, finally achieved by my son. He was proving that our family belonged in that world, that we could create something beautiful and successful and respected. But success changed Daniel. Or maybe it revealed parts of him that had always been there, just waiting for the right circumstances to emerge. The boy who used to help me fold dumplings at the kitchen table became a man who was too busy to return my phone calls.
Our Sunday dinners became monthly dinners, then holiday-only dinners, then just Christmas and his birthday. When I did see him, he would tell me about the restaurant's success, about the celebrities who dined there, about the investors who wanted to help him franchise. He never asked about my life, my health, my dreams. Amanda was perfectly pleasant to me, the way people are pleasant to service workers. Polite, but distant, never really seeing me as a full person. She would ask how retirement was treating me, not knowing I was still working part-time as a cleaning woman to pay my basic expenses, since I'd given my retirement savings to her husband. I never corrected her assumption that I was financially comfortable. I never told Daniel that I was still working because I couldn't afford not to. Pride, maybe. Or protection. I didn't want my sacrifice to become their burden. 3 weeks ago, Amanda called me, not Daniel. Amanda. Ruby, she said, using my first name the way employers use first names with housekeepers. We'd love to have you over for Mother's Day brunch. Daniel's been so busy with the restaurant, and I thought it would be nice to celebrate family. The invitation arrived a few days later. Cream-colored cardstock, elegant calligraphy, the kind of formal touch that suggested this wasn't just a casual family meal, but some kind of event. Join us for Mother's Day brunch at the Westfield Estate, Sunday, May 12th, 11 a.m., honoring the women who shaped our family. It was signed Daniel and Amanda Nakamura. Westfield Estate. I looked it up online. A $2.3 million house in Willowbrook Heights, the kind of neighborhood where lawn care costs more than most people's rent. My son, who I'd raised in a 2-bedroom apartment, now lived in a mansion.
My investment, though he didn't know it was mine, had paid for more than just a restaurant. This morning, I spent an hour deciding what to wear. Everything I owned looked shabby compared to the world Daniel and Amanda inhabited. I settled on a navy blue dress I'd bought for Kenji's funeral 20 years ago. Still appropriate, still dignified, even if it showed its age. As I got ready, I thought about what this day might mean. Maybe Daniel wanted to acknowledge everything I'd done for him. Maybe he was ready to see me as more than just his hardworking mother. Maybe success had finally given him enough confidence to be proud of where he came from. I took the bus to Willowbrook Heights, 3 transfers, nearly 2 hours of travel time. I could have called a cab, but old habits die hard. Besides, I wanted time to think, to prepare myself for whatever this day would bring. As the neighborhoods changed outside the bus window, from modest apartments to suburban developments to gated communities, I felt that familiar tug of displacement. This was Daniel's world now, a world I'd helped him reach but could never fully enter. The house was everything the photos had suggested, and more. Georgian architecture, perfectly manicured gardens, a circular driveway with a fountain at the center. This wasn't just success, this was wealth, the kind that gets passed down through generations. And as I walked up those marble steps to ring the doorbell, I thought about all the paths that had led us here. My broken dreams financing his realized ones. My invisible sacrifices creating his visible success. My silence protecting his pride. I had no idea that in the next hour, everything I thought I knew about respect, family, and my place in my son's life would change forever. Because sometimes the people who should honor your journey are the ones who've forgotten you ever took it. The doorbell at the Westfield estate wasn't just a bell. It was a symphony of chimes that announced arrivals like a cathedral calling the faithful to worship. I pressed the brass button and listened to the melody echo through what I imagined were marble hallways and crystal chandeliers, spaces so grand that sound itself seemed to expand and flourish. Within seconds, the heavy oak doors swung open, revealing Amanda in all her perfectly curated glory. She wore a cream-colored silk blouse that probably cost more than my monthly rent, paired with tailored navy slacks that had never seen a washing machine, the kind of clothes that required dry cleaning and careful storage. Her hair was styled in that effortless way that takes 2 hours and a professional to achieve, and her makeup was flawless despite the early hour. "Ruby!" she exclaimed, her voice pitched with the kind of enthusiasm that sounds rehearsed rather than genuine. "You look so lovely. Come in, come in. Daniel is just finishing up a call with the restaurant. You know how it is. Business never stops when you're successful." The comment hit like a small needle, so subtle that protesting would make me seem oversensitive. Business never stops when you're successful. The implication being, of course, that I wouldn't understand such pressures, having never achieved that level of success myself, at least not in any way that Daniel or Amanda knew about. I stepped into the foyer and immediately felt the weight of wealth pressing down on me like a physical force. The ceiling soared 20 feet above us, supported by columns that belonged in a museum. A crystal chandelier hung in the center, its 1,000 facets catching the morning light streaming through stained glass windows that depicted some abstract pattern in blues and golds. The floors were genuine marble. I could tell because I'd cleaned enough imitation marble in office buildings to know the difference. And they stretched in every direction like a frozen lake of luxury. "Your home is beautiful," I said, because that's what you say when confronted with such obvious displays of wealth, even when the beauty feels cold and calculated rather than warm and lived in.
Amanda beamed with the pride of someone who'd married into this lifestyle rather than built it herself. "Thank you. We just had the interior designer finish the East Wing last month. She's the same one who did the governor's mansion. Very exclusive, very tasteful. We're thinking of being featured in Architectural Digest next year." She led me through rooms that felt more like museum exhibits than living spaces. The living room contained furniture that looked expensive but uncomfortable, all sharp angles and neutral colors, the kind of decor that prioritizes appearance over function. Abstract art hung on the walls. the kind that costs tens of thousands of dollars not because of its beauty, but because of the name in the corner. Daniel should be down any moment, Amanda continued as we walked. He's been so excited about today. He kept saying how important it was to honor the women in our family, especially you. He has such respect for everything you've done, all the sacrifices you made for him. The words should have warmed my heart, but something in Amanda's tone made them feel hollow. She spoke about my sacrifices the way people talk about historical events, acknowledging their importance while making it clear they belonged to a different era, a simpler time when such hardships were necessary but are now, thankfully, obsolete. We passed through a dining room that could have seated 20 people, its mahogany table polished to mirror brightness and surrounded by chairs that looked like they'd never been sat in. A sideboard along one wall displayed fine china and crystal glasses, the kind of collection that gets used twice a year and requires a staff to maintain properly. Daniel has told me so much about your restaurants, Amanda said, though the way she said restaurants made it sound quaint, like a child's lemonade stand. It must have been so different back then, running a small family business, so much more personal than what we do now, of course. Daniel's always saying how the industry has evolved, become more sophisticated, more global in its approach. I nodded politely, though every word felt like another small cut. Everything about this house, this conversation, this entire setup seemed designed to remind me of my place in the hierarchy, the struggling immigrant mother whose small dreams had paved the way for her son's grand achievements. We entered what Amanda called the morning room, a sun-drenched space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking perfectly manicured gardens. The furniture here was slightly more comfortable, though still chosen for appearance rather than actual use. A coffee service was already laid out on a glass table, delicate porcelain cups and saucers, silver sugar bowl and cream pitcher, everything arranged with the precision of a high-end hotel. "Please, sit anywhere you'd like," Amanda said, gesturing to the various seating options. "I'll go get Daniel. He's probably lost track of time. You know how passionate he is about the restaurant." As she glided away on her designer heels, I took a moment to really absorb where I was. This wasn't just a house, it was a statement. Every piece of furniture, every carefully placed accessory, every architectural detail was chosen to communicate wealth, status, and taste. It was the kind of home that appeared in magazines, the kind that made visitors feel simultaneously impressed and inadequate. I chose a chair near the windows and looked out at the gardens. Even the landscaping was perfect, every hedge precisely trimmed, every flower bed arranged in patterns that probably required a team of gardeners to maintain. There were no weeds, no brown spots on the lawn, no signs that nature was allowed to exist here without careful management and control. The silence in the house was different from the silence in my small apartment. At home, quiet meant peace, solitude, the comfortable emptiness of a space where I could truly be myself. Here, the silence felt heavy with expectation, filled with the weight of objects that cost more than most people's annual salaries. I heard footsteps on what sounded like a marble staircase, followed by voices, Daniel and Amanda having a quick conversation I couldn't quite make out. Their tones were low but animated, the kind of hurried discussion that happens when hosts are making last-minute adjustments to their carefully planned event. Daniel appeared in the doorway, and for a moment, I felt that familiar surge of maternal pride mixed with something that might have been loss. My son had grown into a handsome man, successful and confident in a way I'd always dreamed he would be. He wore a casual but expensive sweater and lax, the kind of weekend wear that costs more than most people's work clothes, but is designed to look effortless. "Mom," he said, crossing the room with arms extended, "you made it! I was worried about you taking the bus all that way. You should have let me send a car."
He hugged me, and for a brief moment I was transported back to when he was small, when my embrace could solve any problem and my presence was all he needed to feel safe in the world. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by the awkward politeness of two people who share DNA but no longer share a life. "The bus was fine," I said, settling back into my chair. "I like watching the neighborhoods change. It gives me time to think." "Still the philosopher," he said with a laugh that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Always finding meaning in the ordinary."
The comment stung more than he probably intended. Always finding meaning in the ordinary. As if my ability to find significance in everyday experiences was a charming quirk rather than a survival skill learned through decades of making do with less. Amanda returned with a tray of what looked like professionally prepared pastries, croissants that were too perfect to be homemade, delicate fruit tarts that belonged in a French bakery window. She set them down with a flourish, clearly proud of the presentation. "I got these from Maison du Bois downtown," she announced. "They're the ones who do all the catering for the mayor's events. I thought you'd appreciate real artisanal pastries, Ruby, given your background in food." There it was again, that subtle condescension wrapped in apparent thoughtfulness. My background in food. As if my decades of creating innovative cuisine, my years of building a restaurant from nothing, my understanding of flavors and techniques that had once earned critical acclaim could be reduced to a background that qualified me to appreciate someone else's pastries. "They look beautiful," I said, taking a small croissant that tasted exactly like expensive butter and skilled technique, but lacked any soul or personality. Daniel poured coffee from what was clearly an expensive espresso machine built into the wall of an adjacent kitchen that I could glimpse through an archway. The kitchen itself was a monument to culinary ambition. Professional-grade appliances, marble countertops that stretched for miles, hanging pot racks filled with copper cookware that gleamed like jewelry. "So, Mom, tell us what you've been up to," Daniel said, settling into a chair across from me. "It feels like we never get enough time to really catch up." The question was polite but distant, the kind of inquiry you make when you're supposed to show interest but don't really want to know the answer. How could I tell him what I'd been up to? That I still cleaned offices 3 nights a week because my retirement savings were currently paying for his marble countertops? That I'd been following Jade Garden's success in food blogs and magazines, watching from the outside as my investment created the life he was living? "Oh, the usual," I said vaguely. "Staying busy, reading, tending my little herb garden. Nothing as exciting as running a successful restaurant." "Well, you earned your rest," Amanda said with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "All those years of hard work, you deserve to take it easy now." Earned my rest. As if I were some kind of retired workhorse being put out to pasture. My productive years behind me. My value now measured in the gracious way I accepted my irrelevance? Daniel leaned forward with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for discussing business opportunities. "Actually, that's part of why we wanted to have you here today. We've been talking about family legacy, about honoring the foundation that made our success possible." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe this was it, the moment when Daniel acknowledged what I'd contributed, when he recognized the connection between his dreams and my sacrifices. Maybe he'd figured out about the investment, or maybe he was ready to include me in his success in some meaningful way. "We know how proud you are of what we've built with Jade Garden," Amanda continued, seamlessly picking up Daniel's thought. "And we want to make sure that your part in our journey gets the recognition it deserves. Your part in our journey, not our shared journey, not our family journey, but their journey in which I had played a part, like a supporting actress in a movie about their success." The restaurant has been featured in Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, and next month we're going to be on the cover of Metropolitan Dining. We're being called the future of Asian fusion cuisine in America. The James Beard Foundation has us on their watch list for next year's awards. I smiled and nodded, genuinely happy for his success, even as each accolade reminded me of my own invisible contribution to it. "That's wonderful, Daniel. You've worked so hard.
We have, Amanda corrected, including herself in the achievement. But we know it didn't start with us. It started with you, with the values you instilled, with the work ethic you demonstrated every single day. The words were right, but something about the way she said them made me feel like I was being managed, like a potentially difficult relative who needed to be handled carefully to avoid causing problems. That's why we wanted to do something special today, Daniel said, glancing at Amanda with a look that seemed to say, "Are we ready for this?" Something that really captures the essence of who you are and what you represent to our family. Amanda excused herself, saying she needed to check on something in the kitchen, but I had the feeling this was all part of a choreographed performance. Daniel and I sat in the morning room, sunlight streaming through the windows, highlighting the distance that had grown between us despite our physical proximity.
The comment stung more than he probably intended. Always finding meaning in the ordinary. As if my ability to find significance in everyday experiences was a charming quirk rather than a survival skill learned through decades of making do with less. Amanda returned with a tray of what looked like professionally prepared pastries, croissants that were too perfect to be homemade, delicate fruit tarts that belonged in a French bakery window. She set them down with a flourish, clearly proud of the presentation. "I got these from Maison Dubois downtown," she announced. "They're the ones who do all the catering for the mayor's events. I thought you'd appreciate real artisanal pastries, Ruby, given your background in food." There it was again, that subtle condescension wrapped in apparent thoughtfulness. My background in food. As if my decades of creating innovative cuisine, my years of building a restaurant from nothing, my understanding of flavors and techniques that had once earned critical acclaim could be reduced to a background that qualified me to appreciate someone else's pastries. "They look beautiful," I said, taking a small croissant that tasted exactly like expensive butter and skilled technique, but lacked any soul or personality. Daniel poured coffee from what was clearly an expensive espresso machine built into the wall of an adjacent kitchen that I could glimpse through an archway. The kitchen itself was a monument to culinary ambition. Professional-grade appliances, marble countertops that stretched for miles, hanging pot racks filled with copper cookware that gleamed like jewelry. "So, Mom, tell us what you've been up to," Daniel said, settling into a chair across from me. "It feels like we never get enough time to really catch up." The question was polite but distant, the kind of inquiry you make when you're supposed to show interest but don't really want to know the answer. How could I tell him what I'd been up to? That I still cleaned offices 3 nights a week because my retirement savings were currently paying for his marble countertops? That I had been following Jade Garden's success in food blogs and magazines, watching from the outside as my investment created the life he was living? "Oh, the usual," I said vaguely. "Staying busy, reading, tending my little herb garden. Nothing as exciting as running a successful restaurant." "Well, you earned your rest," Amanda said with that bright smile that never quite reached her eyes. "All those years of hard work, you deserve to take it easy now." Earned my rest, as if I were some kind of retired workhorse being put out to pasture. My productive years behind me, my value now measured in the gracious way I accepted my irrelevance. Daniel leaned forward with the enthusiasm he usually reserved for discussing business opportunities. "Actually, that's part of why we wanted to have you here today. We've been talking about family legacy, about honoring the foundation that made our success possible." My heart lifted slightly. Maybe this was it, the moment when Daniel acknowledged what I'd contributed, when he recognized the connection between his dreams and my sacrifices. Maybe he'd figured out about the investment, or maybe he was ready to include me in his success in some meaningful way. "We know how proud you are of what we've built with Jade Garden," Amanda continued, seamlessly picking up Daniel's thought. "And we want to make sure that your part in our journey gets the recognition it deserves. Your part in our journey, not our shared journey, not our family's journey, but their journey in which I had played a part, like a supporting actress in a movie about their success. The restaurant has been featured in Food and Wine, Travel and Leisure, and next month we're going to be on the cover of Metropolitan Dining," Daniel said, his voice taking on the excited tone he got when discussing media coverage.
We're being called the future of Asian fusion cuisine in America. The James Beard Foundation has us on their watch list for next year's awards. I smiled and nodded, genuinely happy for his success, even as each accolade reminded me of my own invisible contribution to it. That's wonderful, Daniel. You've worked so hard. We have, Amanda corrected, including herself in the achievement. But we know it didn't start with us. It started with you, with the values you instilled, with the work ethic you demonstrated every single day. The words were right, but something about the way she said them made me feel like I was being managed, like a potentially difficult relative who needed to be handled carefully to avoid causing problems. That's why we wanted to do something special today, Daniel said, glancing at Amanda with a look that seemed to say, "Are we ready for this?" Something that really captures the essence of who you are and what you represent to our family. Amanda excused herself, saying she needed to check on something in the kitchen, but I had the feeling this was all part of a choreographed performance. Daniel and I sat in the morning room, sunlight streaming through the windows, highlighting the distance that had grown between us despite our physical proximity.
Mom, can I ask you something? Daniel said, his voice taking on a more serious tone. Of course. Do you ever miss it? The restaurant business, I mean. Working with food, being in charge of a kitchen? The question caught me off guard. It was the first time in years that Daniel had asked me anything personal, anything that suggested he thought of me as more than just his supportive but limited mother. Every day, I answered honestly. Food was never just work for me. It was how I expressed love, how I connected with people, how I made sense of the world. When you lose that, you lose a part of yourself. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. I can understand that. Running Jade Garden, I feel that same passion, that same sense of purpose. Food is art, but it's also culture, history, family traditions passed down through generations. For a moment, I thought we were having a real conversation, the kind we used to have when he was younger and still saw me as someone worth listening to. But then his expression shifted, becoming more calculated, more careful. That's actually part of what we wanted to talk to you about today. About traditions. About honoring where we came from while still moving forward. Before I could respond, Amanda returned carrying what appeared to be a beautifully wrapped gift box. It was large, maybe 2 feet square, covered in elegant cream-colored paper, with a silk ribbon that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week. We wanted to give you something special, she said, setting the box on the glass table between us. Something that really represents your journey and your place in our family's story. Daniel stood up, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that reminded me of a politician about to make an important announcement. Mom, you've always taught me that dignity comes from honest work, that there's nobility in service, that the people who keep the world running deserve respect, regardless of what their job title might be. Amanda nodded enthusiastically. Those are such important values, especially in today's world where everyone wants to be famous or important. You've always understood that real worth comes from character and hard work. I looked at the gift box, beautiful and promising, but something in their words was making me increasingly uneasy. The way they were talking about dignity and service and honest work felt like they were building up to something, preparing me for something that might require that preparation. Go ahead, Daniel said, gesturing to the box. Open it. I pulled the ribbon slowly, savoring what I hoped might be a moment of genuine connection with my son. The paper fell away to reveal a white box, the kind used by expensive department stores. I lifted the lid, and for a moment, my brain couldn't process what I was seeing. Folded neatly inside, tissue paper arranged around it like it was something precious, was a maid's uniform, black dress, with a white apron, the kind worn by housekeepers in upscale hotels or wealthy homes. It looked expensive, well-made, professional quality, but it was unmistakably a uniform for domestic service. Resting on top of the uniform was a small cream-colored card.
I picked it up with hands that had started to shake slightly, though I wasn't sure yet if it was from anger or hurt or disbelief. The handwriting was Daniel's, the same careful script he'd used for thank you notes and school projects, for the woman who taught us that dignity comes from any honest work and who showed us that service to others is the highest calling. Back to your roots, with love and respect. Happy Mother's Day. Back to my roots. I stared at the card, reading the words over and over again, trying to make them mean something different than what they obviously meant. Back to my roots, as if my roots were in service, as if the pinnacle of my identity was cleaning other people's messes, as if everything I had built and dreamed and achieved could be reduced to the jobs I'd taken to survive after my real dreams were destroyed. The silence in the room stretched, like a held breath. Daniel and Amanda were watching me with expressions of nervous anticipation, clearly expecting some kind of response, but uncertain what that response might be. "It's beautiful," I said finally, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "Very well made." "We wanted to get the best quality," Amanda said quickly, apparently relieved that I hadn't reacted negatively. "None of that cheap polyester stuff. This is professional grade, the kind they use in the finest hotels." "And look," Daniel added, reaching into the box to lift out the apron, "it has pockets for supplies and the fabric is stain-resistant. Really practical for someone with your experience." Someone with my experience. Not someone with my talents, my creativity, my years of running a successful business and creating innovative cuisine. Someone with my experience cleaning things. "We thought," Amanda continued, her voice getting more animated as she apparently interpreted my calm response as approval, "that maybe you could use it when you help out around here sometimes. You know, for family gatherings, holiday parties. You're always saying how much you miss being useful, being needed."
I had never said any such thing. In fact, I'd gone out of my way to never burden them with my feelings about being excluded from their success, about feeling invisible and unnecessary in their carefully curated life. Plus, Daniel added, warming to the theme, it would be a way for you to be part of Jade Garden's story. We're always talking to reporters and food bloggers about our family heritage, about how our success is built on the foundation of immigrant hard work and traditional values. Having you there in an official capacity, representing that heritage. He trailed off, apparently realizing that he was describing me as a prop in their success story rather than a person with my own dignity and worth. But the damage was done. The gift, the card, the words, it was all perfectly clear now. To my son and his wife, I wasn't Ruby Nakamura, the woman who had once been reviewed in Food and Wine magazine, who had created innovative fusion cuisine before it was trendy, who had built a successful business from nothing and lost it to someone else's prejudice. I wasn't the secret investor who had made their current success possible. I was just Daniel's mother, the cleaning lady who had raised him with good values and who should be grateful for the opportunity to serve in the background of his achievement. "Thank you," I said, closing the box carefully. "This is very thoughtful." Amanda clapped her hands together. "Oh, I'm so glad you like it. We were worried you might think it was too practical, not sentimental enough. But Daniel said you always preferred useful gifts to decorative ones." "He knows me well," I replied, though at that moment I was realizing just how little Daniel actually knew about who I was or who I had been. "So you'll wear it? Maybe next weekend when we have the investors over for dinner? It would mean so much to have family involved in the restaurant's important events." Wear it. Put on the uniform that represented everything I'd tried to rise above, everything I'd worked to move beyond. Become the immigrant cleaning lady in the background of their American success story, visible but not seen, present but not acknowledged as an equal. "Of course," I said, standing up slowly. "In fact, why don't I put it on now, to see how it fits?" Daniel's face lit up with genuine pleasure. "Really? That would be amazing.
"Amanda, can Mom use your dressing room upstairs?" "Absolutely," she said, jumping up with enthusiasm. "It's just up the main staircase, first door on the right. Take your time. We want to make sure it's perfect." I picked up the box and walked toward the staircase, each step echoing in the marble foyer. Behind me, I could hear Daniel and Amanda talking in excited whispers about how well the morning was going, how pleased they were with my reaction, how perfect it would be to have me as part of their next dinner party. The dressing room was larger than my bedroom at home, with mirrors on 3 walls and a chandelier that belonged in a ballroom. I set the box on a velvet-covered chair and looked at myself in the 3-way mirrors, seeing my reflection multiplied infinitely. An elderly Japanese-American woman in a 20-year-old funeral dress, surrounded by luxury she had helped pay for, but would never be allowed to truly share. I opened the box again and lifted out the uniform. It really was beautiful, well-made and expensive, the kind of thing that would make a professional housekeeper feel dignified and valued, if she had chosen that profession freely and was treated with respect while doing it. But that wasn't what this was about. This uniform was meant to put me in my place, to remind me of the hierarchy in this family and where I belonged in it. It was meant to make me grateful for the opportunity to serve, to participate in their success from the appropriate distance. I undressed slowly, hanging my funeral dress carefully on a padded hanger. Then I put on the uniform. The black dress that fit perfectly, they had remembered my size, the white apron that tied neatly at my waist, even white shoes that had been included in the box. When I was fully dressed, I looked at myself in the mirrors. The woman looking back at me was exactly who Daniel and Amanda saw when they looked at me. Not Ruby Nakamura, the chef and entrepreneur, but Ruby the service worker, Ruby the grateful immigrant, Ruby who should be honored by any opportunity to contribute to their success, no matter how demeaning. But they had miscalculated something important. They had forgotten that the woman who had survived the destruction of her dreams, who had raised a son while working 3 jobs, who had secretly funded their entire lifestyle, was not someone who would simply accept being diminished. They wanted me to go back to my roots? Fine. But they had forgotten that my roots weren't just in service. They were in strength, in resilience, in the refusal to be broken by people who underestimated me. They wanted me to wear the uniform? I would wear it, but not the way they expected. I walked back down the marble staircase, the uniform crisp and professional, my spine straight and my head high. Daniel and Amanda were waiting in the morning room, their phones out, clearly planning to take pictures of this moment for posterity. "Mom, you look perfect," he said, his voice filled with what sounded like genuine affection, but felt like condescension. "Doesn't she look perfect, Amanda?" "Absolutely perfect," Amanda agreed, already positioning her phone for the best angle. "This is going to be such a beautiful memory." I stood in the doorway of their morning room, wearing the uniform they had given me to put me in my place, and smiled the same smile I had perfected during decades of serving people who thought my value was measured by my willingness to be invisible. "You're right," I said calmly. "This is perfect, and it's going to be a very beautiful memory indeed."
Because they had just made a mistake that would cost them everything they thought they owned. They had forgotten that the woman wearing this uniform was the same woman who had once built an empire with her bare hands, who had survived its destruction and rebuilt herself from nothing, who had quietly and strategically positioned herself to take it all away from them. They wanted me back to my roots. My roots were deeper and stronger than they had ever imagined. And they were about to find that out. The maid's uniform fit like it had been tailored specifically for me, which, I realized with growing clarity, it probably had been. As I stood in their morning room wearing the black dress and white apron, I watched Daniel and Amanda exchange glances of satisfaction, like directors pleased with how their actors were performing their assigned roles. "You know what?" Amanda said, clapping her hands together with the enthusiasm of someone who just had what she considered a brilliant idea. "Since you're already dressed for the part,
why don't you help me serve brunch? It would be so authentic, so meaningful, having you be part of the experience instead of just sitting and watching. Daniel nodded enthusiastically. That's perfect! Mom, you always said the best way to show love was through service. This would be your chance to really be part of what we've built. I looked at my son, this successful man in his expensive casual wear, standing in his marble-floored mansion, asking his 70-year-old mother to serve him and his wife while wearing a costume designed to remind her of her place. The same son whose restaurant success was built on my secret $180,000 investment, whose mortgage was likely manageable because of the business profits that my money had made possible. Of course, I said, my voice steady and agreeable. I'd be honored to help. The word honored seemed to resonate with them exactly as I'd intended. Amanda beamed like I'd just validated her most generous impulse, and Daniel looked relieved that his mother was being so cooperative about her role in their carefully orchestrated morning. Wonderful, Amanda said, moving toward the kitchen with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having others follow her lead. I've prepared quite a spread. We have smoked salmon from that place Daniel loves, fresh fruit arranged on the good china, and those pastries I mentioned. Nothing too complicated, just elegant. I followed her into the kitchen, and despite my growing anger at the situation, I couldn't help but feel a professional's appreciation for the space. This was a chef's dream. Professional-grade Viking range with 8 burners, double convection ovens, a walk-in refrigerator that belonged in a restaurant, marble prep surfaces that stretched for yards. It was the kind of kitchen I'd fantasized about during the peak years of Sakura Garden, when I dreamed of expanding and upgrading our equipment. Everything was basically ready, Amanda continued, gesturing to various platters and serving dishes arranged on the massive center island. I just need help carrying things to the dining room and making sure everything looks perfect. You have such an eye for presentation. I remember Daniel telling me how beautifully you used to plate food. Used to plate food? Past tense. As if my years of culinary expertise were some quaint historical curiosity rather than skills that might still have value in the present. The dining room? I asked, though I was already calculating the logistics in my head the way I used to when coordinating service at the restaurant. Oh yes, we're eating in the formal dining room today. It's a special occasion after all. Amanda opened the refrigerator and began pulling out covered dishes. I thought we'd use the good china, the crystal glasses, make it really memorable. As I helped her arrange items on silver serving trays, I found myself falling into the familiar rhythm of food service. My hands moved automatically, adjusting garnishes and spacing items for optimal visual appeal, while my mind worked on a completely different level. You know, I said conversationally as I arranged smoked salmon on a platter, this reminds me of the catering events we used to do at Sakura Garden. We once served a reception for 200 people. Everything had to be perfect, every detail coordinated. Amanda paused in her work, looking at me with the kind of polite interest people show when elderly relatives start telling stories about the olden days. That sounds like it was quite an undertaking. Of course, that was before modern catering companies made everything so much more professional. Before modern catering companies made everything more professional. The implication being that what I had done was primitive, amateur, a relic from simpler times before real professionals took over the industry. You know, I continued, lifting a heavy tray of fruit arrangements, Daniel tells me Jade Garden does quite a bit of private catering now. Corporate events, private parties. Very lucrative, I imagine. Oh yes, we're booked solid through the rest of the year. Daniel has such a gift for reading what clients want. Sophisticated, innovative, but not too challenging. He knows how to give people exactly what they expect from high-end Asian fusion. Exactly what they expect. I thought about my grandmother's secret miso base, about the techniques I'd developed through years of experimentation, about the risks I'd taken combining Japanese traditions with Italian influences long before fusion cuisine became trendy. I had been challenging expectations 40 years ago, creating something new and unexpected. Daniel was giving people exactly what they expected.
We carried the serving trays into the formal dining room, a space that felt more like a museum exhibit than a place where people actually ate meals. The table could have seated 12 people easily, its mahogany surface polished to mirror brightness and set with china that looked like it belonged behind velvet ropes. Crystal glasses caught the light from yet another chandelier, and fresh flowers arranged in a centerpiece that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget. Perfect, Amanda said, surveying the setup with satisfaction. Ruby, would you mind just standing by the sideboard there, in case we need anything during the meal? You look so professional in that uniform. It really completes the whole atmosphere. Standing by the sideboard. Like furniture. Like a service person whose job was to anticipate their needs and fulfill them invisibly. I positioned myself where Amanda had indicated and watched as she called for Daniel. He appeared in the doorway, now dressed in a slightly more formal shirt and tie, looking every inch the successful restaurateur entertaining in his elegant home. He surveyed the scene, the perfectly set table, the artfully arranged food, his mother standing attentively in her maid's uniform, and smiled with unmistakable satisfaction. "This is perfect," he said, echoing his wife's assessment. "Mom, you look so natural there. It's like you were born for this kind of service." Born for this kind of service. Not trained by years of professional food service, not experienced in hospitality management, not skilled in the complex choreography of high-end dining. Born for it. As if servitude was encoded in my DNA, my natural state, rather than a role I'd taken on by necessity. They seated themselves at the head and foot of the table, leaving the sides empty, creating a formal distance that emphasized the hierarchy they'd established. Daniel at the head, like a patriarch, Amanda in the position of honor, and me standing ready to serve their needs. "The salmon looks exquisite," Daniel said, helping himself to a generous portion. "Amanda, you've really outdone yourself." I watched him eat the salmon that I'd arranged, garnished with capers and dill that I'd positioned for optimal visual appeal, and wondered if he realized that everything about this meal's presentation reflected skills I'd developed over decades of professional food service. "Ruby," Amanda said without looking up at her plate, "could you refresh Daniel's coffee and maybe bring some of those little sugar cubes from the kitchen, the brown ones, not the white ones?" I moved silently to fulfill her request, filling Daniel's cup from the silver coffee service and returning to the kitchen for the specific sugar cubes she'd requested. When I returned, they were deep in conversation about the restaurant's expansion plans. "The investors are very interested in the downtown location," Daniel was saying. "They think we could triple our revenue within 2 years if we position it right. And the food costs are so manageable now. We've really streamlined the operation, eliminated a lot of the waste that small restaurants struggle with." Eliminated the waste that small restaurants struggle with. Like Sakura Garden struggled with before it was destroyed by circumstances beyond our control. Like every independent restaurant struggles with, trying to balance quality and creativity with financial survival. "More coffee, Mom?" Daniel asked, finally acknowledging my presence. "Of course," I said, moving to refill both their cups. As I leaned over to pour Amanda's coffee, she continued their conversation. "The key is understanding your market," she said, "giving people the level of sophistication they expect without challenging them too much. Innovation for innovation's sake is just masturbation. Sorry, Ruby, excuse my language." She apologized to me the way people apologize to children for swearing in front of them, not because they think their language was truly inappropriate, but because they assume I'm too delicate or unsophisticated to handle adult conversation. Innovation for innovation's sake. I thought about the review that destroyed my restaurant, about Harrison Blackwell's criticism of my attempts to bridge cultures and create something new. Apparently, the problem hadn't been that I was too innovative.
It was that I'd been innovative too early, before innovation became profitable and fashionable. "Ruby," Daniel said, looking up at me as I finished pouring his coffee, "you're being awfully quiet. What do you think about our expansion plans?" The question caught me off guard. For the first time all morning, he was asking for my opinion rather than my service. But something about his tone suggested this was more performance than genuine interest, a way of including the help in the conversation to demonstrate his democratic values. "Expansion can be challenging," I said carefully. "It's easy to lose the personal touch that makes a restaurant special when you start trying to replicate success in multiple locations." Daniel and Amanda exchanged a glance that I recognized, the look of people dealing with someone who doesn't quite understand the complexities of modern business. "Well, that might have been true in the old days," Daniel said kindly, "but modern restaurant management is much more sophisticated now. We have systems, protocols, quality control measures that ensure consistency across locations." The old days, when I was trying to run a restaurant without the benefit of modern systems and protocols, when success was more about personal relationships and individual creativity than efficient scalability. "I'm sure you're right," I said, stepping back to my position by the sideboard. "I'm sure everything will work out perfectly." But even as I spoke the words, I was thinking about the phone calls I would make tomorrow, about the conversations that would happen in offices I'd never see, with people whose names Daniel and Amanda had probably never heard of, about the financial records that would be reviewed, and the questions that would be asked about Jade Garden's initial funding sources.
They wanted to expand. They wanted to triple their revenue. They wanted to build an empire on the foundation I'd provided, while I stood silently in the background wearing a costume designed to remind me of my proper place. "Amanda," Daniel said, cutting into what appeared to be a perfectly prepared piece of melon, "tell Mom about the food festival." Amanda's face lit up with excitement. "Oh, yes! We've been invited to participate in the Metropolitan Food and Wine Festival next month. It's a huge honor. Only 20 restaurants in the entire region get selected." "It's going to be incredible exposure," Daniel added. "Food Network will be there, multiple food bloggers, people from Bon Appetit magazine. This could really put us on the national map. And the theme this year is American innovation. Perfect for what we're doing at Jade Garden. They want us to showcase how Asian cuisine has evolved in America, how it's become something new and distinctly American. How Asian cuisine has evolved in America, how it's become something new and distinctly American." I stood there in my maid's uniform, listening to my son and his wife describe exactly the concept I'd been pioneering 40 years ago, when Harrison Blackwell had declared it inauthentic and inappropriate for someone like me to attempt. "They're particularly interested in our origin story," Daniel said, warming to the subject. "The immigrant dream narrative. How our family's traditional values and work ethic laid the foundation for contemporary success." Our family's traditional values and work ethic, as if those values existed in some abstract realm, disconnected from the specific person who had embodied them and sacrificed everything to pass them on. "Daniel has such a gift for telling that story," Amanda said admiringly. "He makes it sound so inspiring. The struggle, the perseverance, the ultimate triumph. Very American dream." Very American dream. The struggle and perseverance of someone else, repackaged as inspiration for their success story. My life reduced to a compelling backstory that added authenticity to their brand. "We're thinking of having you there, Mom," Daniel said suddenly, looking up at me with what seemed like genuine enthusiasm. "In the background, of course, but visible. You could wear something like this uniform, represent the service and dedication that made everything possible." In the background, visible but not central, present but not equal, representing service and dedication while they received credit for innovation and success.
What a wonderful idea, I said, my voice perfectly pleasant and agreeable. I'd be honored to be part of your success story. Honored to be part of their success story. Not honored to tell my own story, not recognized for my own achievements, but honored to serve as a prop in their narrative of triumph. Perfect, Amanda exclaimed. We can probably get some wonderful photos. The 3 generations represented, the continuity of family values, the evolution from traditional service to contemporary innovation. 3 generations. Daniel, Amanda, and me. But in their framing, I represented the past, traditional service, while they embodied the present and future, contemporary innovation. As if innovation was something that had been invented by their generation rather than something I'd been practicing before they were born. I should probably start making some calls, Daniel said, pulling out his phone. The festival organizers want to confirm our participation by the end of this week. He stood up from the table, leaving his half-finished plate behind. Amanda followed suit, both of them moving with the casual assumption that someone else would handle the cleanup. Ruby, would you mind taking care of this? Amanda asked, gesturing vaguely at the table full of dishes and serving pieces. Just put everything in the dishwasher. And maybe wipe down the table when you're done. Would I mind taking care of this? As if I had a choice, as if saying no was even a possibility they had considered. Of course, I said. Take your time with your calls. They left me alone in the formal dining room, surrounded by the detritus of their perfect Mother's Day brunch, wearing the uniform they'd given me to remind me of my place in their hierarchy. I began clearing the tables systematically, stacking plates and gathering silverware with the efficiency that comes from decades of experience in food service. But as I worked, my mind was operating on an entirely different level. I was thinking about phone numbers I hadn't dialed in years, about conversations that would need to happen, about records that would need to be reviewed. I was thinking about the careful steps that would need to be taken to unravel the foundation of their success without leaving any fingerprints on the process. They wanted me to represent the service and dedication that made their success possible. They wanted me visible but background, present but secondary, honored but diminished. What they didn't realize was that the woman clearing their dishes had built and lost an empire before, had survived the complete destruction of her dreams and rebuilt herself from nothing. They didn't know that their success was entirely dependent on money I'd given them, on sacrifices I'd made, on expertise I'd developed long before they thought to dream their dreams. And they certainly didn't realize that by putting me in this uniform, by reducing me to a symbol of grateful service, by using me as a prop in their success story, they had just made the biggest mistake of their entitled lives.
I finished clearing the table and carried the dishes to the kitchen, where I loaded them into the dishwasher with the same methodical precision I brought to everything I did. Then I wiped down the dining room table until it gleamed, returned the unused serving pieces to their proper places, and made sure everything was exactly as it should be. By the time Daniel and Amanda returned from their phone calls, the formal dining room looked exactly as it had before brunch, every trace of the meal eliminated, every surface restored to perfection. "Everything looks wonderful," Amanda said approvingly. "You're so thorough, Ruby. It's clear where Daniel gets his attention to detail." Where Daniel gets his attention to detail. From me. From the woman they'd just dressed up as their servant, whose life's work they'd reduced to a heartwarming backstory for their contemporary success. "Well," Daniel said, checking his watch, "I should probably drive you home, Mom. I know you don't like to be out too late." I don't like to be out too late? As if I were an elderly child with a bedtime, rather than a woman who took the bus because she'd given her transportation money to fund his dreams. "Actually," I said, smoothing down the apron of my new uniform, "I think I'll wear this home, if that's all right." Daniel's face broke into a smile that was equal parts surprise and delight. "Really? You want to keep it on?"
I want to see how it feels, I said truthfully, to really understand what you've given me. That's so sweet, Amanda said, clasping her hands together. See, Daniel, I told you she'd love it once she understood what we meant by it. What they meant by it. A gift designed to put me in my place, to remind me of the hierarchy they had established, to ensure I understood my role in their success story. They drove me home in their BMW, the luxury sedan gliding through neighborhoods that grew progressively less affluent as we approached my modest apartment complex. I sat in the passenger seat, wearing my maid's uniform, watching the landscapes of my two different worlds pass by the window. Thanks again for today, Mom, Daniel said as he pulled into my driveway. It meant so much to have you there, to share our success with you, to share their success with me, not to acknowledge my role in creating it, not to recognize my contribution to making it possible, but to graciously allow me to witness what they'd accomplished. Thank you for including me, I said, getting out of the car, and thank you for this beautiful gift. I gestured to the uniform I was wearing, and Daniel beamed with satisfaction. Wear it in good health, Mom. We'll call you about the food festival. As they drove away, I stood in front of my apartment complex in my professional-grade maid's uniform, watching their taillights disappear around the corner. Then I walked upstairs to my small apartment, where I sat down at my kitchen table and opened an old address book I hadn't touched in over a decade. It was time to make some phone calls. It was time to remind some people that Ruby Nakamura was still alive, still thinking, and still very much in the game. Because they wanted me to go back to my roots, tomorrow I would start showing them exactly what those roots were capable of growing. The address book felt fragile in my hands, its leather cover worn smooth from decades of use, and its pages yellowed with age. I hadn't opened it in years, but muscle memory guided my fingers to the section I needed. The names written in faded ink represented connections from another lifetime. Colleagues, suppliers, industry contacts from the days when Ruby Nakamura was someone people in the food service industry knew and respected. I dialed her number, unsure if it was still current, but hoping that some connections survive even decades of silence. Helen Wu speaking. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it, crisp, professional, but with an undertone of warmth for people she considered worthy of her time. Helen? This is Ruby Nakamura. I don't know if you remember me, but we worked together at Metropolitan Hospital in the early 90s. There was a pause, and I could almost hear her mental filing system clicking through old memories. Ruby! Of course I remember you. You were the one with the grandmother's miso recipe that made those awful hospital vegetables actually taste like food. How are you? It's been, 30 years? 32 years, I said, surprised by how much relief I felt at being remembered as someone with actual culinary skills, not as someone's cleaning lady. I'm well, Helen, still in Riverton Heights. I'm calling because I need some information about the local restaurant industry, and I thought you might be able to help.
Of course. What can I tell you? I took a deep breath, knowing that how I framed this conversation would determine everything that followed. I'm researching some restaurants for a potential investment opportunity. Specifically, I'm looking into the background of a place called Jade Garden in Millbrook Heights. Have you heard of it? Jade Garden? Helen's voice took on the tone of someone who had professional opinions to share. Oh, yes, very trendy place. Owned by a young man named, Daniel something. Japanese name, I believe. Daniel Nakamura, I supplied. That's right. Interesting coincidence with your last name. Any relation? I decided to stick as close to the truth as possible while revealing as little as necessary. He's my son. Your son? Helen's voice became significantly more animated. Ruby, that's wonderful. You must be so proud. The restaurant has gotten excellent reviews, and I hear they're expanding soon. Yes, he's done very well for himself, I said carefully. That's actually what I wanted to ask you about. I'm trying to understand more about how restaurant financing works these days, particularly for high-end fusion places like his. Things have changed so much since my day.
Oh, absolutely. The industry is completely different now. Much more sophisticated, much more dependent on investor capital and strategic partnerships. A place like Jade Garden would have needed significant upfront investment, probably 200,000 minimum to get started, maybe more for that location and level of finish. 200,000? I had given Daniel 180,000, which meant either he'd found additional funding or Helen's estimate was slightly high. But her number confirmed what I'd suspected. My contribution had been essential, not supplementary. That's a substantial investment, I said. I assume banks are more willing to lend to restaurant ventures now than they used to be? Helen laughed, but it wasn't a particularly amused sound. Actually, it's gotten harder, not easier. Banks are very conservative about restaurant loans, especially for unproven concepts. Most successful new restaurants are funded through private investors, family money, or partnerships with established restaurant groups. Family money, private investors. Exactly what I told Daniel his mysterious benefactor was. So, if someone like Daniel was able to secure funding, it would likely have been through personal connections rather than traditional banking? Almost certainly. And Ruby, if you're considering investing in restaurant ventures, you should know that due diligence is absolutely critical these days. Too many family restaurants get into trouble because they don't properly document their funding sources or maintain clear financial records. Due diligence, clear financial records. I thought about the documentation I'd kept from my transaction with Daniel, the paper trail that established me as his silent partner, whether he knew it or not. Helen, let me ask you something specific. If someone invested in a restaurant through private arrangement, say a family member or silent partner, what kind of legal protections would they have? Well, that would depend entirely on how the arrangement was structured. If it was properly documented as an investment rather than a gift, the investor would typically have rights to financial information, profit sharing, and potentially even operational input depending on the terms. And if it wasn't properly documented, then you'd have problems. But Ruby, surely your son's restaurant has proper documentation for all its investors. I was quiet for a moment, considering how much to reveal. Helen, can I speak to you in confidence? Of course. I provided Daniel with his startup funding, but I told him it came from an anonymous investor. I wanted him to feel independent, to believe he'd succeeded on his own merit. But now I'm wondering if I should have been more transparent about the arrangement. Helen's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Ruby, are you telling me you gave your son nearly $200,000 to start his restaurant and he doesn't know it came from you? 180,000. And no, he doesn't. And you have documentation proving you made this investment? Bank records, cashier's checks, correspondence with his attorney during the setup process. Everything was handled through a shell company I created for the transaction. A shell company? Helen's voice had taken on the tone of someone who was reassessing everything they thought they knew about a situation. Rumi, do you understand what this means legally? I'm beginning to understand it better. That's why I'm calling you. I need to know what my options are. Your options? Ruby, if you can document that investment, you potentially own a significant portion of that restaurant. Did Daniel's attorney never ask about the source of the funding? I told him it was from a private investment company that preferred to remain anonymous. It's not uncommon in the industry. No, it's not uncommon at all, but Ruby, if you're the actual source of that funding and you have documentation to prove it— Helen trailed off and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Do you mind if I ask you why you're looking into this now? Has something happened? I looked down at the maid's uniform I was still wearing, at the white apron that was supposed to remind me of my proper place in my son's success story. Let's just say that I'm reconsidering the terms of our arrangement. Ruby, I think you need to talk to a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, someone who specializes in restaurant and hospitality law. This could be very complicated, especially if Daniel has been operating under the assumption that his funding came from an anonymous third party. Do you know anyone you'd recommend?
Actually, yes. There's a firm downtown, Morrison, Chen and Associates. Patricia Chen handles a lot of restaurant industry cases. She's tough,
discreet, and she understands the family dynamics that come up in these situations. Morrison, Chen, and Associates. The irony wasn't lost on me that the lawyer Helen was recommending shared a name with Harrison Blackwell, the food critic who destroyed my first restaurant 40 years ago. Could you give me her contact information? Of course, but Ruby, before you do anything dramatic, are you sure this is what you want? Family businesses can get very messy when legal issues get involved. Helen, my family has already gotten very messy. I'm just trying to clean it up. After I hung up with Helen, I sat at my kitchen table making notes in the margins of my address book. Patricia Chen's phone number, the name of her firm, key phrases Helen had used that I wanted to remember: due diligence, financial documentation, investor rights. My next call was to someone I hadn't spoken to in even longer, Robert Kim, who had been the accountant for several restaurants in the downtown district back in the 80s. If he was still working, he would understand the financial structures that modern restaurants used and might be able to help me understand exactly what leverage my investment gave me. The phone rang 4 times before a familiar voice answered. Kim and Associates, this is Robert. Robert, this is Ruby Nakamura. We worked together back in the 80s. You handled the books for several restaurants, including Sakura Garden. Ruby Nakamura. Robert's voice immediately became warmer. My God, I haven't heard from you in decades. How are you? Are you back in the restaurant business? Not exactly, I said, but I'm involved in restaurant financing in a way that's become complicated. I was hoping you might be able to give me some advice. Of course. What's going on? I gave Robert the same basic information I'd shared with Helen, though I emphasized the financial aspects more heavily. Robert was an accountant, not a food service professional, so his perspective would be different, but equally valuable. So let me make sure I understand, Robert said, after I had finished explaining the situation. You provided startup capital for your son's restaurant through a shell company, but you told him the money came from an anonymous investor. Now you're wondering about your legal and financial rights as the actual source of that funding. That's correct. And your son has no idea that you're the investor? None at all. Robert was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear the sound of a calculator in the background. Ruby, this is a significant sum of money we're talking about. $180,000 invested 5 years ago in what's now apparently a successful restaurant. Do you know what the current value of that business is? I don't have exact figures, but they're talking about expansion, they're participating in major food festivals, and they just moved into a $2 million house. A $2 million house? On restaurant profits? Robert's tone suggested he was running calculations in his head. Ruby, successful restaurants can be very profitable, but that level of personal wealth suggests either the restaurant is extremely successful or there are other factors involved. What kind of other factors? Well, if your son has been operating under the assumption that his startup funding was legitimate investment capital, he may have been able to secure additional loans or investors based on what appeared to be a strong initial financial foundation. In other words, your money might have been leveraged to attract other funding sources. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. You mean my investment might have made other investments possible? Exactly. Banks and investors are much more willing to fund restaurants that already have demonstrated financial backing. Your $180,000 might have been the foundation that allowed him to raise additional capital. And if that's the case, then you're not just an investor in the restaurant, Ruby. You're potentially the key investor, the one whose money made everything else possible. The key investor, the foundation that made everything else possible. I thought about Daniel and Amanda's casual dismissal of my relevance to their success, their assumption that I was just a proud mother grateful to witness their achievements. Robert, if I wanted to clarify my position as an investor, what would that process look like? Well, the first step would be a thorough financial audit of the restaurant's books. You'd need to understand exactly how your initial investment was used, what other funding was secured, and what the current value of the business is. Then you'd need legal representation to establish your rights as an investor. And if my son objected to this process, Ruby, if you can document your investment and it wasn't structured as a gift, your son's objections wouldn't be legally relevant. An investor has rights regardless of family relationships. After I finished my conversation with Robert, I made 2 more calls. The first was to Patricia Chen's office, where I scheduled an appointment for the following Tuesday. The second was to my own bank, where I arranged to have copies of all my financial records from the past 5 years sent to Patricia's office. By the time I was done with my phone calls, the sun was setting outside my small apartment windows. I was still wearing the maid's uniform, and something about that felt appropriate. This outfit that Daniel and Amanda had given me to remind me of my place was becoming a symbol of their miscalculation.
They thought they knew who I was. The grateful immigrant mother, the cleaning lady who should be honored by any opportunity to serve in the background of their success. They had no idea that the woman they dressed up as their servant was the same woman who had built and lost a business empire, who had survived complete financial ruin and rebuilt herself from nothing. And they certainly had no idea that their entire success was built on money that still, legally and morally, belonged to me. I made myself a simple dinner: rice, vegetables, a piece of fish that I prepared with techniques I'd learned in professional kitchens 40 years ago. As I ate, I reviewed the notes I'd made during my phone calls, organizing information and planning my next steps. The maid's uniform was surprisingly comfortable, well made, as Amanda had mentioned, with practical details that showed someone had thought carefully about the needs of the person wearing it. The pockets were perfectly positioned, the fabric moved easily, and the apron protected the dress underneath from spills and stains. It occurred to me that this uniform represented everything Daniel and Amanda thought they understood about work, service, and value. To them, it was a costume that represented simple, honest labor. The kind of work that should be grateful for recognition, that should never aspire to ownership or control. What they didn't understand was that the woman wearing this uniform had already owned and controlled more than they could imagine. And what they definitely didn't understand was that she was about to do it again. I finished my dinner and washed the dishes, then sat back down at the kitchen table with my address book. There were still more calls to make, more connections to reestablish, more information to gather. But the foundation was now in place. Tomorrow, I would continue wearing this uniform as I went about my daily activities. I would wear it to my appointment with Patricia Chen. I would wear it when I met with the financial advisors who would help me understand the full scope of my investment's impact. I would wear it as I systematically gathered all the information I needed to demonstrate exactly who Ruby Nakamura was and what she was capable of. Because Daniel and Amanda wanted me to go back to my roots, they wanted me to embrace my identity as a service worker, to find dignity in honest labor, to be grateful for any opportunity to participate in their success. Fine. I would show them exactly what those roots had grown into. I would demonstrate what happens when someone who has built something from nothing, who has survived the complete destruction of her dreams, who has spent decades learning how systems work and how to navigate them, decides it's time to stop being invisible. They thought the uniform made me smaller, more manageable, easier to dismiss. They were about to discover that it had the opposite effect. The uniform was going to remind me every day of how much they had underestimated me, and it was going to remind them, eventually, of how much they had misunderstood about who they were dealing with. The woman in the maid's uniform was not the woman they thought she was, and by the time they figured that out, it would be far too late to undo the mistake they made by trying to put her in her place. 3 weeks had passed since Mother's Day, and I had worn the maid's uniform to every single meeting. To Patricia Chen's law office, where we'd spent 4 hours reviewing financial documents that proved beyond any doubt that I owned 67% of Jade Garden. To the offices of Morrison and Associates, where a forensic accountant had traced exactly how my initial investment had been leveraged to secure additional funding from 3 separate sources.
to the Millbrook Heights City Planning Office, where I'd learned about the various permits and licenses required for restaurant expansions. Each day, I put on the black dress and white apron, and each day it reminded me of what Daniel and Amanda thought I was versus what I actually was. The uniform had become my battle armor, and I was finally ready for war. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Daniel's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you come to the restaurant right away?" "Of course, sweetheart. Is everything all right?" "Just please come. We're in the office, upstairs." I took the bus to Millbrook Heights, the same route I'd taken dozens of times over the past 5 years to secretly watch my investment flourish into the success story that had made Daniel wealthy. But today felt different. Today I wasn't watching from the outside anymore. Jade Garden looked exactly as impressive as always from the street. The elegant signage, the floor-to-ceiling windows revealing diners at candlelit tables, the valet parking that suggested the kind of establishment where money was no object. It was beautiful, successful, and built entirely on my foundation. I entered through the front door, still wearing my uniform, and approached the hostess station. The young woman behind the podium looked at me with the polite confusion of someone trying to figure out why a cleaning lady was walking into an upscale restaurant during lunch service. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone suggesting she assumed I was lost. "I'm here to see Daniel Nakamura. He's expecting me." "Oh!" Her expression shifted immediately. "You must be Daniel's mother. He mentioned you might be stopping by. He's upstairs in the office. Just take those stairs by the bar." As I walked through the dining room, I caught glimpses of the kitchen through the service windows. Professional equipment, efficient staff, the kind of well-orchestrated operation that only came from significant investment and careful planning. My investment. My planning filtered through decades of restaurant experience they never bothered to ask about.
The upstairs office was cramped but functional, filled with the kind of paperwork and computer equipment that modern restaurants required. Daniel was seated behind a desk that looked like it hadn't been cleared in weeks, and Amanda was pacing by the window with her phone pressed to her ear. "Mom," Daniel said, standing up when he saw me. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes that suggested he hadn't been sleeping well. "Thank you for coming." "You sounded upset," I said, taking the chair across from his desk. "What's wrong?" Amanda finished her call and turned toward us. Her usual composure cracked around the edges. "Ruby, we've had some very concerning conversations with our accountant and our lawyer. There seem to be some irregularities with our initial funding that we need to clarify." "Irregularities?" I almost smiled at the careful language. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. Daniel pulled a manila folder from the chaos on his desk and opened it to reveal bank records, legal documents, and correspondence that looked very familiar to me. "Our accountant has been contacted by someone claiming to have documentation of our startup funding. Apparently, there are questions about the source of our initial investment, and..." He trailed off, staring at the papers in front of him. "And?" I prompted gently. "And it appears that our anonymous investor might not have been as anonymous as we thought." Amanda sat down heavily in the chair next to me. "Ruby, this could destroy us. If there was fraud involved in our initial funding, if someone lied about the source of our investment capital, the restaurant could be shut down. We could face criminal charges." Criminal charges. The words hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that was just beginning to spread. "That sounds very serious," I said. "Have you been able to contact this anonymous investor to clarify the situation?" Daniel looked at me with the expression of a man who was beginning to understand that everything he thought he knew about his life was built on quicksand. "Mom, the investment company that funded our startup, Elmshore Holdings LLC, apparently it's just a shell company. There's no actual investment firm, no board of directors, no business history. It exists only on paper." "How strange. Do you have any idea who might have created such a company?" "That's what we're trying to figure out," Amanda said, her voice sharp with stress. "Someone went to a lot of trouble to hide the real source of our funding. The question is why." I looked at my son and his wife, both of them sitting in their expensive clothes in their successful restaurant, surrounded by the fruits of my labor and investment, and I made a decision.
I can answer that question, I said quietly. They both stared at me. The reason someone went to a lot of trouble to hide the real source of your funding is because the real source didn't want you to feel beholden. She wanted you to believe you had succeeded on your own merit, through your own hard work and talent. Daniel's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: confusion, understanding, denial, and finally a kind of horrified recognition. "Mom," he said slowly, "what are you saying?" I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder that contained copies of every document Patricia Chen and I had compiled over the past 3 weeks. Bank records showing the transfer of $180,000 from my accounts to Elm Shore Holdings, LLC. Legal documents establishing the shell company, correspondence with Daniel's original attorney discussing the investment terms. I placed the folder on Daniel's desk and opened it. I'm saying that Elm Shore Holdings, LLC was created by me, funded by me, and operated by me for the sole purpose of providing you with the startup capital you needed to open this restaurant. The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the sound of lunch service continuing downstairs, the clink of silverware, the murmur of conversation, the normal sounds of a successful restaurant that was built on my money. Amanda was the first to speak. That's impossible. You don't have that kind of money. She stopped herself, but I knew what she was about to say. You're just a cleaning lady. You're just Daniel's mother. You're just someone who should be grateful for any opportunity to serve in the background of our success. I'm what, Amanda? I asked pleasantly. I just meant, where would you get $180,000? From 35 years of working multiple jobs and saving every penny for my son's future. From selling everything I owned that had any value, from emptying my retirement accounts so that Daniel could have the chance I never got to have again. Daniel was staring at the bank records like they were written in a foreign language. But you told me it was from an anonymous investor. You made me promise never to try to find out who it was. Because I didn't want you to feel guilty about taking money from your mother, who cleaned office buildings at night. I didn't want you to feel like your success was built on my sacrifice. I wanted you to believe you had earned this through your own merit and talent. But you did want me to feel guilty about not appreciating that sacrifice? Daniel's voice was rising, and I could hear decades of complicated family dynamics surfacing in his tone. No, Daniel, I wanted you to succeed, and I wanted you to remember where you came from, not so you'd feel guilty, but so you'd stay humble and grateful and connected to the values that made your success possible.
Amanda stood up abruptly, beginning to pace again. This is a disaster. If it comes out that we've been operating under false pretenses, that our funding came from your son's mother, I suggested. From someone who isn't a legitimate investor? Ruby, no offense, but you don't know anything about restaurant investment or business partnerships. If our other investors find out that our initial funding came from someone who wasn't properly vetted, someone who doesn't have experience in the industry? I let her finish, then smiled the same polite smile I'd perfected during decades of dealing with people who underestimated me. Amanda, before I gave Daniel that money, I spent 6 months researching restaurant financing, reviewing business plans, and consulting with industry professionals about the viability of his concept. I may have cleaned office buildings for work, but I also built and ran a successful restaurant for 5 years before you were born. That was 40 years ago, she said dismissively. The industry has changed completely since then. Yes, it has. It's become more sophisticated, more dependent on investor capital, more focused on brand management and scalability, all of which I researched extensively before I decided to fund Daniel's venture. I reached into my purse again and pulled out another folder. This contains my complete due diligence report on Jade Garden's business plan, including financial projections, market analysis, and risk assessment. I also have documentation of the ongoing monitoring I've done of the restaurant's performance over the past 5 years. Daniel opened the second folder and began reading. His expression changed from confusion to amazement to something that might have been respect. Mom, this is incredibly detailed, professional-level analysis.
I told you, Daniel, I may have worked as a cleaning lady, but I never stopped being a businesswoman. Amanda sat back down, her face pale. So what happens now? What do you want from us? It was the question I'd been waiting for, the moment when everything I'd planned over the past 3 weeks would come together. What I want, I said, is recognition for what I've contributed to this restaurant's success. What I want is to be treated as an investor and partner, rather than as the grateful mother who should be honored by any opportunity to serve in the background. But we are our partner, Daniel said quickly. I mean, now that we know, of course you're our partner. No, Daniel, I'm not your partner. According to the legal documents that established your business structure, I'm your majority investor. I own 67% of this restaurant. The words hit them like physical blows. Amanda actually gasped. Daniel stared at me like I just told him the building was on fire. That's impossible, Amanda whispered. Patricia Chen, my attorney, has reviewed all the documentation. My initial investment of $180,000, combined with the additional funds that were secured using my investment as collateral, gives me controlling interest in Jade Garden. Daniel was frantically flipping through papers, trying to understand how his world had just turned upside down. But the business loan, the equipment financing, the investors who came in later, all of it was secured using the foundation I provided. Without my initial investment, none of the other funding would have been possible, which means that legally and financially, I'm not just an investor in your success, Daniel. I'm the primary owner of it. Amanda was shaking her head like she could make my words untrue through sheer denial. This can't be legal. You can't just secretly fund someone's business and then claim ownership years later. Actually, Amanda, that's exactly how business investment works. The fact that I chose to remain anonymous doesn't change the legal reality of the financial arrangement. I stood up, smoothing down my maid's uniform, and both of them stared at the outfit that had seemed so appropriate when they thought it represented my proper place in their hierarchy. I've been very patient. For 5 years, I've watched you build success on my foundation while treating me like the grateful mother who should be honored by any opportunity to serve in the background. We didn't know, Daniel said desperately. Mom, if we had known it was your money, what? You would have treated me differently? You would have included me in business decisions? You would have seen me as something other than the cleaning lady who raised you with good values? The questions hung in the air, and I could see from their expressions that they were beginning to understand how thoroughly they had misjudged the situation. But we gave you that uniform out of love, Amanda said weakly. We were trying to honor your work ethic, your dedication to service. I looked down at the black dress and white apron I was wearing. Yes, you did. And it was the perfect gift, Amanda, because it reminded me every day of how little you understood about who I am and what I'm capable of. I picked up my purse and both folders of documentation. I'm wearing this uniform to our meeting with your attorney tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Patricia Chen will be presenting our proposal for restructuring the ownership and management of Jade Garden to reflect the actual financial reality of our partnership. What kind of restructuring? Daniel asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The kind that acknowledges that the woman in the maid's uniform is not your employee or your grateful beneficiary or your symbol of immigrant work ethic. She's your boss. I walked toward the door, then paused and looked back at them.
Oh, and about the Metropolitan Food and Wine Festival next month, I'll be representing Jade Garden as the owner and head chef. You're welcome to attend as my employees if you'd like. Amanda made a sound like air being let out of a balloon. Head chef? Ruby, you haven't worked in a professional kitchen in decades. I smiled, and for the first time in this entire conversation, it was completely genuine. Amanda, I've been working in professional kitchens longer than you've been alive. The only difference is that now I'll be working in my own kitchen, in my own restaurant, wearing whatever I choose to wear. I left them sitting in their office, surrounded by the paperwork that proved their entire life was built on a foundation they'd never bothered to understand or appreciate. As I walked back through the dining room, past the tables full of customers eating food prepared in the kitchen that my money had equipped, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 40 years, the complete satisfaction of owning my own success. The next morning, I put on my maid's uniform one last time and went to the meeting with Daniel, Amanda, and their attorney. Patricia Chen presented our terms with the kind of professional precision that made it clear this wasn't a negotiation, it was a presentation of facts. By noon, the ownership structure of Jade Garden had been legally restructured to reflect reality. Ruby Nakamura was listed as the majority owner and CEO. Daniel Nakamura was listed as the general manager. Amanda Nakamura was listed as assistant manager. By evening, I was standing in the kitchen of my restaurant, wearing chef's whites instead of a maid's uniform, preparing for the dinner service that would mark the beginning of my second act in the food industry. Daniel and Amanda were working their shifts with the same professionalism they'd always shown, but with a new understanding of the hierarchy they operated within. They were learning what it felt like to work for someone who valued their contributions while never letting them forget who was actually in charge. And 6 weeks later, when Food and Wine magazine published their feature article about Jade Garden's mysterious owner, who had emerged from decades of quiet investment to reclaim her place in the culinary world, the photograph they used showed a 70-year-old Japanese-American woman in pristine chef's whites, standing confidently in her own kitchen, surrounded by the success she had built twice. The caption read, "Ruby Nakamura. From immigrant dreams to culinary empire, proving that some roots grow deeper than anyone imagines." I kept the maid's uniform, though. It hangs in my office now, a reminder that sometimes the best way to show people who you really are is to first let them completely misunderstand who they think you're supposed to be. Because when someone gives you a costume designed to put you in your place, the most powerful thing you can do is wear it while you take their place instead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.